Okay, so it's day 266 of the war in Ukraine, and we have a number of critical updates to go over, and it ties a number of these things together. I was just looking over previous videos. So here we're talking about the missile strike in Poland. Here we're talking about what's going to happen next. Here we're talking about what's going on in Kherson. We're talking about the election this past week and what's going to happen now that they've recovered. I'm going to tie a lot of these threads together. So just stay with me. If you're not familiar with me, my name is Darren Gertis. I'm a professor, and I've been doing these updates every day about Ukraine, every day since I started on day 85. That's day 265. Here we go. So the first thing is the ISW, the Institute for the Study of War. The Russian military likely used a substantial portion of its remaining high-precision systems in the coordinated strikes on November 14th. So I said we're going to tie things together. So the G20 meeting was yesterday. Zelensky speaking, and there were some critics that were saying, well, because he said this, that's why they took the strikes. That's not it. The ISW made it clear. The missile strikes, it's coordinated missile strikes. It takes a lot of work. The Ukrainian air defense has shot down 73 of about 100 or so of these, and all drones. Ukraine's increased shoot-down percentage illustrates its improvement. Ukrainian air defenses in the last month. But they said something really interesting. I'll talk about that after. Polish officials announced that a likely Russian-made missile had landed in Poland within 6 kilometers of international border of Ukraine. But the question was whether that Russian-made missile was fired by Russia or whether it was fired by Ukraine. Now, again, a missile went over the border into Poland, and that is NATO territory, and that could be very, very dangerous, the beginning of World War III. The Kremlin likely deliberately planned a massive missile strike campaign, this is what I was saying, hold on for, in anticipation of Zelensky's speech at the G20, and they do this every time. They do this when there's a big speech at the UN or NATO or Ramstein or whatever else. The Russian pro-war community on Telegram claimed that the Kremlin retaliated for Zelensky's Russophobic statements, but the impossibility of launching such a massive attack on short notice highlights the Kremlin's disinterest in setting the stage for negotiations with Ukraine. That last line's really important because it shows you what was premeditated, and I wouldn't have known that but for the ISW. Okay, the high costs associated with Russian offensive push on Pakliva continue to generate criticism in Russian military leadership. Okay, where is Pakliva? I showed you this the other day. It's this little tiny town here, and if you go back a couple of days, they were just after Kherson's offensive. They were saying, look what we did. We took, so this was about the day of Kherson's offensive, and then the next day in the Russian press, they showed how we took Paklova. Well, this area, this tiny little area here is Paklova, and they're not getting very far, as you can see day over day. They're not making a lot of ground, okay? But that just shows you they just keep throwing these soldiers into it, throwing them into it because they're essentially cannon fodder. Okay, next. So the missile strike yesterday, and I talked about this. I had a couple little updates, and I said, okay, is it intentional? If it's intentional, that's very bad. Maybe it's a trial balloon. Maybe it's just testing the resolve of NATO, because they said that they would also defend every square inch. So did they mean it? Maybe it was an accident. Accidents happen. They were kind of close to the border, within a reasonable enough range that it could have happened. So Zelensky said, I have no doubt that it was not our rocket, he told reporters. Now, this stands to reason. He's not shooting off his rockets at Poland, but hold on. Let's see the rest of this. RT breathlessly saying a missile that allegedly killed 2 people in Poland on Tuesday was most likely launched by Ukrainian air defense forces. Polish President Andrzej Duda has announced. Okay, every once in a while, RT can get it right. They're quoting the Polish president. Most likely, a missile made by Russia in the 1970s has fallen on Polish territory. We have no evidence that it was launched by Russia. Duda told reporters there's a high probability that it was Ukrainian air defense missile, he said. Let's stop there. Now, if I was a propagandist, and remember I did this one on this video on how propaganda works. In fact, I'll link that at the end if you want to see it. If I was a propagandist, I wouldn't just read this and kind of interpret what's going on at face value. I would say, but really, what's going on? Are the Poles scared of the Russians? Are the Poles in the pocket of NATO who doesn't want to get into a war and they're just talking a big game? Was it really even maybe it was an American-made? I would be doing that kind of thing. I'm not raising those kinds of questions because this is like straight news and interpretation. But when you see that kind of thing, those lingering questions, you know you're dealing with propaganda. Okay, let's get back to that. That was free. Duda said it was an unfortunate accident rather than a deliberate attack on Polish soil. Ukraine was defending itself, which is obvious and understandable, by also firing missiles whose task was to destroy Russian missiles in midair, Duda said. Therefore, the Russian side is definitely to blame for yesterday's incident. That's right. That's exactly what it was. They wouldn't have been firing it off if the Russians hadn't been sending 100 or so missiles at Ukraine. And so it was their air defense. So by way of analogy, think of it like this. So there's a person driving a car and they swerve and they kill somebody. But so the driver is at fault, but the driver is not really at fault if he was trying to swerve to get out of the way, to avoid hitting some drunk that staggered across the road and at the last minute stepped out in front of him and then he swerved. He's not at fault. The guy that caused the accident isn't really the driver, it's the other guy. So that's what he's saying here, and I think that's a pretty fair analysis. Okay, in The Guardian, we see a little bit more nuance and some really weird criticism. Missile that struck Poland came from Ukraine. Ukraine's air defense was probably responsible. Joe Biden said it was unlikely the missile had been fired by Russia. Within an hour or two, Duda was on the phone with Biden and the Prime Minister of Britain, and they were putting out statements. Hey, we've already talked. We're going to investigate. Let's not rush to a hasty judgment. Polish president said that the information from Warsaw was that the missile was a S-300 rocket made by the Soviet side, old rocket, and there's no evidence it was launched by the Russian side. NATO Secretary General also confirmed that while an investigation was underway, initial analysis suggested the incident was likely caused by Ukrainian air defense missile. Okay, and let me be clear, said Jens Stoltenberg, NATO Secretary General, this is not Ukraine's fault. Again, it's like the driving example that I just gave you. And so that was pretty much the end. Well, there's a little bit more. Dmitry Peskov said several countries, including Poland, have made baseless statements about Russia's involvement in another hysterical, frenzied Russophobic reaction without having any idea of what happened. Okay, so here's the thing. If something goes stolen and you know somebody who has been to jail many times for stealing, you would think the blame would be naturally pretty obviously likely to be them. So if it's likely to be them, because like nobody else is firing missiles off in a neighborhood except for Russia firing it on Ukraine and Ukraine trying to defend itself, it's not from, Romania or Moldova. So it's not Russophobic to use your common sense. Okay, here's another RT, the missile that hit Poland, and there was only one thing here, but it adds a little bit of nuance to our thinking. So here, this is RT speaking to a Russian audience. This is an English translation of it, but it's saying the missile that hit Ukrainian, they said the same stuff that we just saw, and then they also said, they added that the same day, Russian aircraft and ships conducted massive strikes on Ukrainian command and centers and energy infrastructure. The high-precision strikes were carried out against targets on Ukrainian territory, no closer than 35 kilometers from the Ukrainian-Polish border, it said in a statement. Now, this is how it's always portrayed. They didn't say anything about 73 out of the 100 were shot down. They don't, no, let's not talk about that. Right? They don't want to say that, but that's the kind of thing. And then they repeated that hysterical claim and the other bit from Peskov. This article said almost all the same stuff, except there is a Ukrainian leader secretary of the National Security Defense that wants to jointly study with its Western partners and share information, find out what's going on, because Ukraine was obviously convinced that it was Russia, not Ukraine. And it may be that the facts are that it was an errant defense missile that went out. Nevertheless, that's what it looks like. And that actually is kind of the best case scenario because unfortunately, pretty much every other scenario leads us closer to the brink of a World War III, and we want to avoid that. Okay, nevertheless, there's still damage on the other side, right? Like we have to think about like what are the actual consequences here of this. Father Bogdan Wozny is a minister in just over the Polish border. A Russian-made missile flown out of Ukrainian territory killed 2 of his parishioners, and so there's actually like real damage on the other side. The physical border here was also mentally separated us from the war in Ukraine. We always felt this way. The day after the missile launch, we never felt danger here. So they've never felt it, but it's kind of like the Crimeans, right? The Crimeans always felt like, oh, Ukraine can't touch us. Now the Poles are like, wow. I mean, the war just came home, and it's in a tragic way. People are afraid, but still haven't had enough time to talk to each other, to process it. And so now they're going to be thinking about this in a much bigger way. Unfortunately, for this tragic reason, everyone's going to remember Przewodał. We would rather our village had remained obscure. You know, it is a tragedy every way you cut it, but this is a small scale tragedy on a stage of a wide tragedy. Like, I mean, how many tens, maybe even hundreds of thousands of people have died now since Putin has decided to invade his neighbor? I remember watching the first few days. I was watching the news, and there was a lot of news coverage, and then they kind of fell off and got off of the radar of most of our news, at least in the United States. And I remember in the first couple days watching, there was a lady who was down in a tunnel. I think this was on Fox News. It might have been a different channel, but I think it was Fox. She's down in the railroad, and she says, you know, if I run through a red light and I kill somebody, I'm going to jail for that. What Putin has done is kill all kinds of people here indiscriminately, and nothing's going to happen to him. And I thought, you know what? This is so tragic. That's exactly what's going on. And this is why he needs to be held responsible. And that's what Zelensky was laying out at the G20. Here are the terms. And the terms include things like holding the Russians ultimately responsible. And they have to deal with their reparations, and they have to deal with secure borders afterwards. Ukraine was not attacked because they were part of NATO. They were attacked precisely because they're not in NATO's protection. That's the only reason that they were attacked. If they were part of NATO, this would not have happened. So, okay, I'm going to stop. If you want to hear more about that, you can go back and watch what we talked about yesterday. Zelensky did a masterful job with that, by the way. The Verkhovna Rada is the Ukrainian parliament. It extends martial law, general mobilization in Ukraine for another 90 days. This is nothing new except for updating. The war's not over, so we still are in martial law. They did it a couple days in. It was extended for 90 days. They reinstated it again after 90 days. They're reinstating it again now, and hopefully sooner or later they won't have to do that. Okay, the Russians mined everything. So now let's talk about what's going on in Kherson. Kherson, we're starting to find out the horror stories of what's actually happening there. The Russian troops, just as they left, they were very intentional about leaving mines everywhere that they could think about. This is the head of the Ukrainian Deminers Association, NGO, said, we can't make forecasts yet as the clearing procedure has already started, but potentially the region of Kherson could be the most mined region in the country. And unfortunately, Ukraine could soon rank first in the world for number of casualties caused by mines. Okay. Russia came in initially on February 24th saying, we have to do something about these neo-Nazis at the top of the government in Ukraine. And so that's why they came in. It wasn't to go kill indiscriminately Ukrainians. Remember, Ukrainians are supposed to be their brothers. This is evil. That's what it is. Let's call it that. This is terrorism. It's not okay. Russians mined everything they could. Roads, lands, bridges, houses, buildings, everything. We find mines all the time. I've never seen anything like this before. Now, it gets worse, and I told you it was going to get worse. We were going to get accounts of stuff like this. Alleged Russian torture room uncovered and liberated Kherson. Ukrainian investigators have uncovered a claimed torture room in Kherson city. They would come in and beat us up and completely disoriented, said Ira, who owns this kiosk outside a detention center. And they said things like he was told the beatings were, so one man is beaten just because his son is a serving soldier. Like that's the reason. And so they have this torture room. Oh, they only beat me a little. I was lucky, said another. Yeah, we're going to find out all kinds of stories about this in the upcoming days. And it's not just going to be here. When they liberate other places across the country, more of those stories will come forward. Okay. I'm going to switch my gears a little bit, talk about the presidential election. Right now it's 49-48, but it's pretty clear that 49 and 50 on the Democrat side, that the Democrats are going to hold. And even if the Republicans win Georgia in the runoff election, it'll still be 50-50, which means that the Democrats in the United States will still control the Senate. At the same time, the Republicans, this says 218 for a majority. The Republicans have just taken the House, and the Republicans gained 8 seats. The Democrats lost 8 seats, and the Republicans will probably take 5 more or so, something like that. So there'll be a comfortable majority, not a blowout, but a comfortable majority. So last night, this just happened. Former President Trump announced for a White House bid in 2024. I do not believe that if Trump was elected, and I know some of you would absolutely hate that for other reasons, but I do not believe that if Trump was elected, Ukraine support would vanish or diminish or whatever else. He said in his speech last night, and I watched the whole thing, that if he was still president, Ukraine would never have happened. And what he's saying is that the U.S. projected weakness, like the way that they left Afghanistan and things along those lines, and maybe Biden sent mixed signals that he would not have sent. I don't think that that anything will change. But there's also another player out there, and that's Ron DeSantis. And Ron DeSantis, as far as the Republicans go, these are both Republicans. These are kind of the two leading contenders. He's the governor of Florida. And so what's interesting about DeSantis is he's got a pretty conservative but not populist kind of bent. And so I think he would even be more than Trump still supporting Ukraine. And I think in either scenario, but even more in DeSantis' scenario. If you're at all interested, I just put this out on Facebook last night. After Trump did his announcement, I put out Republican poll, Don or Ron. Donald Trump or Ron DeSantis, Republicans only, please. And so just think, how now this is a largely conservative crowd. I asked for Republicans only, and I got Ron, someone that cares about individual liberty, Don, Ron, Don, Ron, either Ron, Don. Okay, and there's 3 more here, Ron, Don. Okay, so generally, by a pretty wide margin, it seems like Republicans in general were, at least at this point, in my small circle of the world, favoring Ron DeSantis. I don't know that it's not scientific in any way, but that's just where we are. Okay, last little bit. So some time ago, you're going to start seeing in the underneath the videos, I'm going to put a little blurb about this. I talked to a guy a little while back about he's a Ukrainian and he's trying to support himself by selling Ukrainian merchandise like this. Okay, and so it is, if you go to, if you type in HTTP UA, that's UA like Ukraine, supporter.com/my name, what will happen is it'll bring you to this website and you can buy overpriced Ukrainian stuff. But the beauty of this, and I'm a business professor, right? I'm a management professor. So I absolutely love this. This guy is paying his bills because he's going to, and he approached me. He said, "Hey, you're doing these videos. Please, would you partner with me and let me, sell through here?" Now, I'll get a few pennies on a dollar of this, so I'm not making very much at all, but I believe it's beautiful that he is working so hard trying to contact these people. I actually kind of want to do an academic case study on him later, but that's kind of nerd talk. I think it's beautiful that he's actually selling the stuff, that he's making money by doing that, supporting himself at a time where we're giving billions of dollars in aid, that he's actually taking care of his own business. And so I would encourage you to think about that. If nothing else, I would encourage you to find, even if you don't find it here, find something. When you're wearing something, you're identifying with that cause, and that's an important thing. But I think this is great that he's doing that, and so I'm going to be putting that under all of my videos as well. Why? Well, if you're a skeptic, you would think like Charlie Brown's little sister.
What are you up to, big brother? I'm trying to sell Christmas wreaths from door to door. Getting on the old commercial bandwagon, eh? Going after those big holiday bucks, huh?
Yeah, that's not exactly what I'm doing. I'm barely it's barely worth my while, but I think it's very worth my while to support a Ukrainian who's trying to take care of himself and his own business, and that he was smart enough to think through this. And so, if you buy it, that's great. If you don't, you won't hurt my feelings. But I'm going to be putting this out there. Okay, thank you for your time. I'm going to ask you to do one more thing, and if you haven't watched, I talked about the video about propaganda, about how Russian propaganda works earlier in this. Please watch that if you have not already, because it will really help you understand what is true and what's fiction, because there's a lot of noise out there in the news. All right, thank you for your time, and thank you for caring about Ukraine.